I came home one weekend and saw a bruise on my mom's face. That was the last straw. I remember the first time I realized my life wasn't like other kids. I was 8 years old, sitting on the floor of our small living room, trying not to cry while my stepfather, Jason, screamed at my mom. She didn't fight back anymore. She just took it. I hated that. I hated feeling powerless. Jason wasn't just angry. He was cruel. He had this way of humiliating people, making them feel small, like nothing they did mattered. And for some reason, I was his favorite target. If Mom cooked something wrong, I had to listen to him bark at her while I watched. If I made a mistake in school, he'd drag me across the living room, yelling at me for hours about how I was useless, lazy, never enough. And it wasn't just words. Once, he slammed my backpack so hard against the wall it split open, scattering my books across the floor. He laughed while I cried. I hated him, but I hated feeling scared even more. I hated how Mom seemed trapped, how she flinched at his every word. Dad had died when I was little, too little to really remember him. Sometimes I'd try, grasping at fleeting memories of his face, his laugh, but all I had was a shadow. And Jason filled that empty space with anger, making sure I always remembered that Dad wasn't here to protect me. By the time I hit 12, I stopped crying. I stopped talking back. I learned to survive by blending into the walls, moving quietly, avoiding his attention. But I was always watching, always calculating. There was something inside me that refused to let him win, not just over me, but over my mom, over our lives. High school was worse. Kids noticed my bruises sometimes. I lied. I told them I fell. But they laughed at me for being different anyway. Skin too dark, too skinny, always quiet. I learned quickly. People only respect fear, anger, or money. I had none. It was during those years that I started planning. Not in some childish way, like imagining revenge in my head, but in real, calculated ways. I watched Jason. I learned his routines, his pride, his weaknesses. He was careful with money, but careless with people. He boasted to his friends about deals he hadn't closed, lied to neighbors about his wealth, and underestimated everyone around him. By the time I turned 18, I had a plan. I didn't want to just get back at him. I wanted him to lose everything he was proud of. His power, his reputation, his image. And I wanted Mom to finally feel safe. The first move was small. I started keeping records. Photos, receipts, screenshots of messages he didn't realize I saw. Every time he yelled at me, I remembered. Every lie he told, I wrote down. I wasn't doing it for anyone else. This was mine. I needed proof. I needed leverage. One night, I was in his study, helping him with his taxes. I watched him fumble, making mistakes, ignoring rules. I stayed calm, pretending to be clueless while my mind raced. That's when I realized how easy this was going to be. He was reckless, arrogant, and blind. The next day, I started planting subtle doubts. I asked questions to his friends, his coworkers, about decisions he made. Just casual, innocent-sounding questions. Didn't the supplier say something about late shipments? I thought the business license needed renewal. Didn't that happen last month? People didn't notice anything at first, but the seeds were there. And then came the first real confrontation. I was 17. Jason came into my room, furious over something small, my grades, a late chore, I can't remember. He slammed my door, shouting. I didn't flinch. I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Why do you do this?" He froze. "Do what?" he snapped. "This," I said. "Yelling at us, humiliating Mom, humiliating me. You think it makes you powerful, but it just makes you small." His face went red. "You dare," he started, but I didn't let him finish. "You think you're smart," I said. "You think you can control everything, but I see through it. I've been watching. You're not as clever as you think." He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was nervous, forced. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the walls. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, power. Not physical, not brute force, but control over my fear. Over the next year, I started small. I exposed little lies to people who trusted him, his friends, neighbors, even a couple of colleagues. Nothing that could ruin him yet, just small cracks. And each time, I saw the effect. Confusion in his eyes, anger in his voice, doubt spreading around him. I also found allies. My best friend, Tony, became my partner. He didn't know everything, just that Jason was cruel. But he trusted me, and that was enough. Together, We began collecting more evidence, documenting everything that could ever be used against Jason if the time came. The year I turned 19, I had enough. Enough proof. Enough strategy. And I realized something crucial. Revenge wasn't about rage. It was about patience, about intelligence, about making sure when the walls fell, they fell in such a way that he couldn't recover. The first big move was simple, but effective. I leaked some discrepancies in his business to a trusted associate, someone who had been with him for years but had been suspicious. Within days, questions arose. Emails were exchanged, doubt spread. Jason didn't notice immediately. He never did. But by the end of the week, he was scrambling, lying, trying to cover up mistakes he didn't even know were being documented. And that was when I felt it, a shift. He was no longer untouchable. The boy who had cowered under his shadow was becoming the man who could finally strike back. It wasn't about hating him anymore. It was about reclaiming life, about making sure Mom could breathe again, about proving that cruelty could be challenged, that arrogance could be exposed, and that even someone who grew up in fear could find a way to fight back. The stage was set. Jason's empire of lies was fragile. His reputation, built on intimidation and charm, had cracks I could exploit. And I had time, patience, and strategy. By the time I left for college, I knew one thing. Jason's downfall wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And I was ready to be the one holding the trigger. College was supposed to be my escape, a chance to breathe, to live in a world that wasn't filled with fear and humiliation. But even hundreds of miles away, Jason's presence haunted me. Every phone call, every message, every story I heard from Mom reminded me that the war wasn't over. I tried to focus on classes, on friends, on anything to distract myself. I buried myself in studies, late nights, libraries, anything that would numb the ache of knowing Mom was still trapped. But every time I hung up the phone after a call with her, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the anger, the fear, the helplessness. I had been patient. I had been planning. I had been collecting proof, keeping my records, and waiting for the right moment. I knew I couldn't strike yet. Not until I had enough leverage. Not until it was clean, decisive, and irreversible. And then, one weekend, everything changed. I came home Friday night, carrying the weight of the week and hoping for a quiet evening. I had told Mom I was coming. She had sounded relieved on the phone. I imagined us having dinner together, talking about college, laughing at silly things I had seen in the city. For a brief second, I let myself hope. I stepped into the kitchen and froze. It wasn't the yelling, there was none. It wasn't the slammed doors. Everything was eerily quiet. But there she was, my mom, standing by the counter with a faint tremor in her hands, making tea. And then I noticed it. A dark bruise under her left eye. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't even ask at first. I didn't need her to speak. I could see it. I could see the shame, the pain, the exhaustion that went far beyond tiredness. I felt rage boil up inside me, a fire I hadn't felt since I was a kid hiding in my room, listening to Jason berate her. Mom, my voice was low, trembling. She looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw the tears she had been holding back. She tried to force a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. It's nothing, she said softly. I tripped. I hated her for lying. I hated Jason for making her lie. I hated everything that had brought us here. That was the last straw. I had already been preparing, but seeing her like this, seeing what Jason had done, there was no more waiting, no more patience. I felt the part of me that had been planning, calculating, strategizing, finally ignite into action. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about protection. It was about justice. That night, I stayed awake, going through my files on the laptop. Every email, every receipt, every screenshot of his lies, every photograph of mistakes he had tried to hide. I mapped out every move, step by step. I didn't just want to humiliate him. I wanted to make sure he could never harm Mom again. The next morning, I confronted him. He was sitting in the kitchen, pretending nothing had happened, drinking coffee with that arrogant smile he always wore. I didn't respond to his smile. I didn't hesitate. Jason, I said, voice cold. I know what you did. He chuckled nervously, looking at me like I was joking. What are you talking about? The bruise, I said. Don't lie to me. Don't look at me like I'm a child. I saw it, and I know it's your fault. His eyes flickered, a tiny crack in his armor. He stammered, but I cut him off. Don't even start. I've been patient. I've watched. I've recorded, I've planned. And now? Now it's over. He laughed, nervously this time, trying to maintain control, but it was weak. I could see it in his hands, the way they trembled slightly as he set his coffee down. I didn't shout. I didn't make threats. I simply laid everything out. Evidence, dates, witnesses, messages, photographs. The proof of his mismanagement, his lies, his humiliation, his abuse. I told him I had already spoken to people who mattered, colleagues, partners, friends, neighbors, that everyone who had once admired him now had reasons to doubt him. He went pale. I can fix it, he said, voice shaking. I can explain. Explain? I raised an eyebrow. Explain that you beat the woman who gave you a home? Explain that you lied, cheated, and tried to ruin everyone around you for your pride? He didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. That was when I made my first legal moves. I contacted a lawyer I had been researching, someone with experience in family disputes and fraud cases. I handed over my evidence. Everything Jason had done to Mom, everything he had done to the business, everything he had done to the family's reputation. Within days, investigations began. People who had trusted him started to question him. Business partners called, concerned. Associates distanced themselves. He couldn't hide anymore, couldn't charm his way out of it. But I wasn't done. I wanted him to understand what losing control felt like. So I made strategic moves to cut him off from the business, to expose mistakes he had tried to cover up, to reveal lies he had told friends and neighbors. Every small victory added to the weight on his shoulders. Every crack in his control was a reminder that he was no longer untouchable. And through it all, I watched Mom begin to breathe again. She smiled, small but genuine, for the first time in years. She started talking about leaving the house for walks, for coffee, for herself. She didn't need me to fight her battles, but knowing I could, that I would, gave her the courage to start reclaiming her life. Jason's arrogance turned to panic. He called friends, tried to charm people, but it was too late. The seeds I had planted months ago were now growing into a storm. He wasn't the golden man he once pretended to be. He was a liar, a coward, a man exposed. By the time I left for college again that Monday, the first real cracks had appeared. And I knew. They were just the beginning. I had planned this carefully, but nothing could have prepared me for the satisfaction of seeing him falter, knowing that every bit of fear and humiliation he had inflicted on Mom would now be reflected back on him. Not with violence, not with rage, but with justice. The boy who had cowered under his shadow was now the man orchestrating his downfall. The weeks after the confrontation were surreal. Jason tried to cling to control, to convince people he was still in charge, still powerful, still untouchable. But everything I had prepared came crashing down on him like a storm he couldn't escape. I remember the first day I realized it wasn't just about proving him wrong anymore. It was about showing him what fear feels like. One by one, business partners who had been loyal to him began questioning his decisions. Investors pulled out, citing unexpected liabilities they had discovered. Even his friends, those who had laughed at my anger and doubt years ago, started distancing themselves. Mom started sleeping better at night. She smiled at the table, no longer flinching at every door slam or sharp tone. Seeing her like that, seeing the freedom on her face, made everything I had done worth it. The bruises weren't just physical, they were years of emotional abuse, years of silence, years of fear. And now, she was finally breathing again. Jason, on the other hand, was crumbling. He stopped calling, stopped messaging, stopped pretending. The arrogance that had been his armor was gone. He looked at me differently now, not with contempt, not with superiority, but with fear. For the first time, he realized I wasn't a child to intimidate. I wasn't going to run, I wasn't going to stay quiet, and I certainly wasn't going to let him hurt Mom anymore. I had taken careful steps. The lawyer I had hired had started proceedings to remove him from all positions of authority in the family business. All of the fraudulent transactions he had tried to hide were exposed. His manipulation of Mom's finances, his attempts to rewrite Dad's will in his favor, they all came to light. The man who had stood over me, screaming and humiliating me for years, had no ground to stand on. But it wasn't just legal. I made sure the truth reached everyone who mattered. Friends, neighbors, extended family. He couldn't manipulate perception anymore. And what was perhaps the most satisfying, yet unexpected, was seeing the people he had helped or mentored turn away from him. His charm, The one thing that had allowed him to humiliate us in peace failed him now. The final straw wasn't just my planning. It was karma, in a way. One afternoon, I received a call from a former investor, someone Jason had tried to swindle months ago. They had investigated, quietly, without telling him. When I spoke to them, I realized they had enough evidence themselves to legally ruin him. I didn't even have to ask. They just wanted to see the truth prevail. And then came the confrontation at the family home, the ultimate moment. He sat at the dining table, exhausted, slouched, defeated. The smirk that had tormented me for so long was gone. Even the neighbors whispered about him behind his back, about his reputation, about the mistakes he could no longer deny. "Jason," I said calmly, "the business is being reorganized. You've lost control. Mom is safe. Everything you tried to hide is out in the open. You no longer have the power you thought you did." He looked at me, eyes wide, a mix of anger and disbelief. You can't. "Watch me," I said, my voice steady. "This isn't revenge. This is justice. For Mom. For me. For everything you've done that you thought would go unnoticed." For the first time, he realized that his world had changed. No manipulation, no threats, no charm could save him now. He had lost everything he had built on lies. And just when I thought it was over, an unexpected twist appeared. One of his old friends, someone I had never met, sent me proof that Jason had been lying to even more people, covering up decades of mistakes and theft. I handed everything to the lawyer. This meant that his social collapse would be permanent. He couldn't rebuild the network he had spent years cultivating. By the end of the month, Jason had lost everything. The business was under new management, with Mom and me ensuring it followed Dad's original vision. His friends no longer called. His associates no longer respected him. Even his name had begun to carry shame rather than awe. I walked through the house one evening, Mom by my side. She looked at me with a quiet smile, finally free from fear. "You did it," she whispered. "No," I said softly. "We did it. This was never about me alone." And she nodded, understanding. Years of humiliation, fear, and silence had ended, but we both knew the scars remained. They would fade, but they would never completely disappear. I also learned something about myself through all of this. I had always been the quiet one, the one who observed, who endured. But I realized that patience, strategy, and intelligence can be more powerful than anger or violence. And sometimes, justice doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be inevitable. Yet life isn't clean, and endings aren't always happy. Jason moved out of the city, almost disappearing from our lives. Rumor has it he's trying to start over somewhere else. He has money, he has survival skills, but he has no respect, no credibility, no trust. He's a shell of the man who terrorized us. And in a way, that was the only revenge I needed. I continued to rebuild my life, my confidence, and my family's business. But the shadow of what we had endured remained, a reminder that cruelty and manipulation leave deep scars. And sometimes, the most important victories aren't just about power. They're about reclaiming your self-respect and protecting the ones you love. The world isn't fair, and life isn't predictable. But I learned that even in the darkest times, you can find a way to fight back. You can take control of the narrative, you can reclaim your power, and you can ensure that cruelty never goes unchallenged. That boy who grew up hiding from the man who humiliated him had grown into a man who could stand tall, not out of pride, but out of strength, patience, and intelligence. And Jason? He became a cautionary tale,